Greetings. Well, it's about time. My teacher have been encouraging me for some years already to spread this information, to share this. It's about time. So he calls it the original Tao. Now, yeah, are there different DAOs? Yet, how we break it apart, maybe to say how we formalize it, more to say expressing the form of it. Well, then it starts with one, because what's before one cannot be spoken of, and one represent that oneness, that unique, that special quality, that, yeah, zero have relative to all numbers, and one have it to some degree, but not as much of specialness. As the only number which is its own dual, which plus 0 and minus 0 are equal, and the sum of every possible number, while being none of them. It includes all and nothing at the same time. Yet, it's ungraspable without one. That function, that plus one or minus one, the beginning of relativity, in order to be able to perceive, so there will be a perception, because perception is always relative. And yet it is part of the absolute, but it is not the absolute itself. Like one is part of the zero, it's included in the plus and minus infinity, all of those numbers combined, and whatever dimensionality of numbers, imaginary and so on. Yeah, and from one, just that function, minus one, we reduce one from infinity, from not even infinity, from the absolute. The absolute that is infinity, but also the opposite of infinity, the minus infinity. When we reduce one from it, and even that one, there is infinity there. Between 1 and 0, there are infinite number of fractions, and between each fraction, it's a fractal quality that reveals itself. But it all starts with that simple function of -1. This what allows all perception. This is the direct extension of the source that enables it to perceive itself through a relative perspective of itself. It starts with -1, which can then become -2 or 3 or whatever number, and then we can multiply and divide and put in powers and roots. And then roots of -1, then it opens a whole new dimension. And in a way, every dimension is like the merging of two. It's the plus and the minus, the polarities. So, yeah, after the 1 comes 2. And 3. Because after all, then the 0 gets its significance also as a number, not too abstract to be perceived. So then there are 3 qualities. There is the plus, the minus, and the 0. Yet before the plus and the minus, the 0 could not have been mentioned yet. It was not complex enough to point on it with its uniqueness of quality. After all, in the plus and minus, there are infinite number of numbers. Yet in the 0 there is only 1 or -1. It's same in that sense. And through the 3, maybe to call it octaves of function, like plus and minus, then divide and multiply, and then in power or roots, it kind of opens another dimension. It opens like 4 quadrants. It opens a 2-dimensional number. And interestingly, then it continues. It continues just naturally, just from that function of -1. It then enables 4-dimensional numbers, putting the function in more complication, considering the position as well as relevant, which is anyway relevant in division or subtraction or in the 3rd octave, like powers and roots. So yeah, it kind of opens four-dimensional numbers, which are these dimensions. Each one of them is infinitely big and infinitesimally fractal, maybe to say. And it's even not the end because complexity even enables to take it to another power of 2 to the 8. And yeah, it's this 8-dimensional number. It's like to take it to how we visualize, to geometry. Well, it's easier to imagine 1, 2, or 3 dimensionality. In 4, it starts to be challenging because we don't have that habit yet. Perhaps. Perhaps it's just a matter of practice. Yeah. Visualizing electromagnetic fields. I guess Maxwell have done it. I guess Einstein then inspired more tangibility of how to visualize it, imagine it. And what is imagining it if not actually perceiving this complexity of more dimensionality? Because after all, everything we perceive, everything we see is the interpretation, is in our imagination. This is the limit of our perception, is our imagination. Yes, also the sensors have a limit, yet what the eye is seeing relative to what the cognition recognizes visually, there is a gigantic gap. Light is still a mystery. This mystery of how can it vibrate in 6 dimensions? What is that even? And how can we think of it? So whatever we see is in a subtler field, perhaps to call it, or space, or set of rules, of laws, of like thought form. It's all mind. I think Buddha said that as well. It's all mind. And yeah, in like 8 dimensionality is like the ultimate singularity. perhaps to say. It's that one object that exists is an eight-dimensional point, yet that point have a geometry, and that is also part of what I find interesting to contemplate on that idea. What is the geometric shape of a point? Is that a circle? Or maybe it is something else? Is that a circle infinitely small? Or perhaps it's a different shape, infinitely small, because it's a point, so it's infinitely small. But what its geometry? Well, maybe in three-dimensionality. So, is it a sphere? But what would be then if not a sphere? So, another suggestion is that it is double tetraheders, that each one is the opposite of the other, sharing the same center point. And in a way, it's a paradox how a point can have a center point. And as far as I understand it, with the limitation of the imagination in perceiving geometry and taking it into hyperspace, then it depends if the point is observed from within or from without, which is the same point and it's infinitely small yet at the same time infinitely big. Exactly like zero. It's nothing yet contains everything. All the plus and all the minus. So from one side it's a sphere. From the other side it's those two tetraheders. Or in two dimensions then it would be two triangles sharing the same space. It's like the minimum closed, perfect closed shape with its dual, which is itself. And in a way it exists in every dimensionality. And in a way it relates to the relation between the shape of black holes and space itself in a five-dimensional cycle, sphere, or how to call it, vortex. It's like all existence is in between these two extremes, these two triangles and the circle. Everything exists. Or this double tetraheders, or this double simplex, and the sphere in its dimensionality. Yet still this geometric metaphor holds on to not so much dimensionality, because there's a lot of counterintuitiveness in breaking the habit of how we imagine. Yet there is a limit to perception, and it's all within what can be thought. It's like the mind is the container of perception, of every possible perception. It's the link of a perception to know its source. It's a little bit reminding me how Descartes' brilliant analysis was interpreted, like I think, therefore I am. So with a doubt, doubting the fundamentals of perception. So, okay, so there is a perception, there is a thinking process, like there is a mind. And then there is someone who is thinking. I think that's not necessarily have to be like that. It's like, I think, therefore the I is thought. Like, what is more fundamental, I or thinking? Perhaps thinking is what creates an I, subject. Perhaps. Or the subject creates a thought, and then the thought can be observed objectively. But perhaps both. And if both, then there are then two types of thoughts. A thought that the subject is thinking, and the thought that creates the subject. The thought of the creator that is beyond selfness. It's called the creator sometimes. It's a name to direct to that ungraspable, yet it's not someone who creates. There is no one, it's zero. And it's just a phenomena. It's just mind manifest as I, that then that I reflect, mirrors the mind as thought. And within that thought, there is cognition, when it starts to recognize patterns. And then it can have an identity, like recognizing itself within existence. But it's all mind, it's all imagination. And even beyond imagination, it's beyond that nation that images are existing in. It's not only images, it's what every image is made of. It's like information, when everything that comes into form lives. Perhaps we can call it like that. There is an interesting phenomena that number that goes then to establish itself in 16 dimensionality. There is some problem in it because the zero loses its singularity. It's like the vantage point of all existence starts to loosen up. It reflects that perhaps something can be precised better in the way we define the two fundamentals that build perception. The zero as the point, as the everything is relative to, and the base function -1. And in a way, as subject, as a singularity, as a 0 point, which is again like a fractal that contains everything within it, same as 0 is made of all numbers, and also it's made of infinite amount of zeros. It's all within it, but every 0 is together with more infinite number of zeros within a 0, and it's that supreme singularity, maybe to call it, realizes, exploring, living, recognizing, learning, whatever word it, but it's revealing itself, more and more faces of itself through each subject. And because that self is that base function, that -1 that becomes separated from the wholeness, that is what is like copy pasted into every subject. It's our starting point, each subject that perhaps hearing me now as I am, every subject is this -1, which is actually representing the ratio to the 0, which is its source, which is its actuality, because there's nothing but the 0. The -1 is a reduction, is minimizing the view in order to be able to define something. Because what is beyond perception. For perception, there needs to be a gap between the perceived and the perceiver, a gap of thought, of definition or experience information. It's a specific form. Specific form that it means it's defined, it's a definition. Yeah, with the language, we evolved technology to some degree to be able to communicate that information, although our language have much limitations. We evolved also mathematics as a language to communicate way more efficient the actual language of nature of the existence. Yet it have also its limitation. It's much more complicated to do these shortcuts that natural languages that we speak, like English and others, allow. But still, the basics of mathematics, it's still from a limited perspective. So in a way it's more advanced language, but perhaps it can refine its base axiom even further to something even more fundamental. And the great philosophers, the mathematicians, yeah, I mean, I'm sure there is much curiosity aimed to that. To those realms that are walked quite alone, not met so much by other people, perhaps other types of beings, but not so much humans, at least not like us now, in these bodies. Still, however it is, the idea is that consciousness, which means that copy-pasted singularity of subject, is actually an adimensional singularity. And all perception is a subspace of adimensionality. And the adimensionality is that geometry, like the adimensional point is holding like the geometry that is the shape of the crystal of consciousness. And holographically, each one of us represent more dominantly other aspects and echoes it, same like in our genome, epigenetically and so on, like it's all holographic. And then in our brain that also works holographically and so on. Yet again, the simplification and going to the basis of perception, the distinguishment of consciousness to relative to awareness, relative to perception, relative to mind, these nuances relative to thought, form and information. These are relevant in these subtleties. Consciousness is already recognition of the self, through awareness, which is a subtler aspect of mind, which is the essential substance. Then a thought is the expression of mind through a consciousness. And information is the objective description of what is, from its, not to call it particle, maybe to call it quantizing, like bits of information. It's like the beats that represent the interconnectivity, the convolution, perhaps to say, of mind. It's an attempt to represent it. It's part of the limitation of our language is information, is putting it into form. The form is defined by the technology of our consciousness, which is our language, which is having its limits, yet the limits is also what allows the precision, the focus. So just to refine and evolve simultaneously the application, but also contemplating on the axioms and opening to inspiration of alternatives to come to finer integration. It's the process of evolution of consciousness, of whatever we are part of, kind of like Earth as a conscious being, and metaphorically maybe to say humanity as the prefrontal cortex of Earth. So it's more the thinking part, the conscious part, that have the concept of itself. Yet we are all, each one of us humans is like a cell in a greater body, and Earth as an organ within the solar system, which is a cell in the galaxy, and so on in this fractal. Yet there is a quality for an adimensional consciousness to perceive, because it's defined, therefore the subspaciousness of it is relevant for the crystallization of consciousness. In a way, the shape of the crystal is the memory of the consciousness. The variations between the sphere and the double simplex, or perhaps this phenomenal EA shape, which its variations, its angles, that same like light breaks through a prism. It's like the trans-singular will breaks through as a specific will that manifests as variety of wills of a certain consciousness. in the base is the will to be, the -1. And thoughts is like every possible thought, every possible not only thought but imagination as thought forms, every thought form that one can experience. For example, in every possible dream, it's all contained within an a-dimensional point, which means within a 7-dimensional infinity. It all contains within. And the crystal of consciousness, having these extensions, so to say, having these openings to perceive 7-dimensionality. And also why-dimensionality, it's like dimensionality, it's like the fundamental tool, at least so far, that we are defining, fundamental tool to perceive a world which one can experience itself. It's like space and time. It's like the fundamentals of who we are, of the world, yet both of them are expressions of dimensionality, and also numbers are expressions of dimensionality. And dimensionality itself as the fundamental tool of consciousness to describe what is and isn't, is that same substance that creates what we experience as space and as time and as numbers. It's like the same essence, all of them. Numbers, it's information, it's thoughts. This idea that there are thoughts, which is perhaps some would call it spiritual or of a different quality, and then there is the physicality. So the idea is that it's the same thing, it's same essence, it's different expressions, yet it's same essence, and that essence is represented with dimensionality. And then consciousness have sensors to experience existence, experience world, experience the not self, not the subject, but having the reflection of itself. And for that, then, the first division after the self and not self, the zero and the function of -1, when the crystal of consciousness come to finalization, then the first division would be to the distinguishment of the sensors and the unity of them. The unity of them as an a-dimensional singularity, and the distinguishment between them as every specific subdimensionality, and in every possible form and variation. And that leads eventually to the creation of the bodies, these avatars of consciousness that have that capacity. So then we have these senses that each one is aimed to perceive a specific dimensionality of input. Every sensor is perceiving different quality. We have the habit to imagine three-dimensionality. The state of matter that have a three-dimensional freedom of motion is gas. It can move freely in 3 dimensions. State of matter in a way below that, denser than that. Every dimensionality is like level of density. So a denser degree of dimensionality would have a 2-dimensional freedom of motion, like liquid. And even denser, the solid will just have 1-dimensional freedom of motion, like gravity. Yet the freedom of motion can grow, or not grow, but is representing itself also in higher dimensionalities, like electromagnetic fields. It's a 4-dimensional freedom of motion. Now the definition of the dimensions would not be necessarily spatial so much. It's different, and it doesn't matter how we define the dimensionality. What matters is the dimensionality, and that it's all like 90 degrees to each other in whatever way we will define it. And so yeah, we can visualize the idea of bending space and how that expresses itself in what space is bending itself. So how can we call it? Maybe then it's space-time. Yeah, so the motion, the expression of motion in space, in the 3D space, is relative, yet with mass and with the possibility of black holes and the white hole, which is like the like space itself. So it's like a 5-dimensional torus, perhaps, to say, between the black holes and the white hole. It's like it's the vibration of space itself. So it's not exactly state of matter, it's just the 5-dimensional freedom of motion. But we have a sensor for that. It's just we don't use the full capacity of it. Like what we hear sound is vibration of space itself, for example. Same like smell, we sense the gas. Taste, we taste the liquid. Touch, we sense the solid. So it's like each dimensionality have a sensor to perceive that degree of dimensionality. As denser it is into one dimensionality, the more focused and precise in its expression it is. Through touch we can communicate a lot. Most. We can get to know each other the deepest through touch. Through thought forms, like 7-dimensional freedom of motion, we can express potentially a lot, yet we need to go way further to evolve the technology to express deeper what we can express there. It's not as focused. Language is not as evolved. And even math. More likely, if an ET would come here, it would speak in math more than English. Yet, can we speak math? It's very rare that someone can actually communicate in that language, but some of us can, to some degree. Eyes see light like the string that vibrates in 6-dimensionality, the photon. I think Leonard Cohen kind of like said, like, the cracks is where the light comes in to the world. I know I'm quoting it wrong, but the idea, it's like light expresses itself within the 5-dimensional space-time that exists in a way within light, but light that we can see, we perceive only a tiny part of the spectrum, so it's waves, electromagnetic waves that then manifest as space and mass that then fractalize themselves into plasmatic fields, into particles, basically, that then crystallize more into molecules that then crystallizes stronger and stronger to liquid and solid. And yeah, there are two of these 7-dimensionalities. There are two sensors that are less recognized and less talked about or familiar. We have less evolved language to perceive the objectively, to interpret objectively, like with the left brain, the input from them, like the 4-dimensional sensor and the 7-dimensional sensor. Like the 7-dimensional in a way, the pineal sensor in the middle of the head, like receive like a radio transmitter and receiver, and transforms the wave, like the pupil in the pineal sensor is like the antenna, and then there are those crystals that transform the wave into electricity, and vice versa, potentially. And it's another sensor. Every mammal, bird, reptile have that. Actually, jellyfish is like the beginning of it, like the most primitive animal, evolutionary speaking, at least moving animal. And yet, this pineal sensor is fascinating by itself and is like what can contain everything, and is the one we imagine through and think through and dream through. That's why we also need to sleep to balance that. It's a very important sensor. And many people, it's like stuck on one radio channel, hypnotically maybe even to say, and just stuck there and not able to move to different channels to refresh the mind, to free the mind, the imagination, to think in other ways and not monotonically. Like, and yeah, it's through the quieting of that channel. There are so many channels, and it's another potential, and it's not like less real. That input is not less real than whatever we see. It's two different sensors. It's both physical in the same way it is spiritual. It's like the same thing. These are just concepts. These are thought forms. Yet we can observe the form that already is, that we don't need to invent. We can observe through the senses, through all of them as one. And yes, also the rules that we discover from that function -1 and what it revealed to us. It revealed the logos, the structure, the form of thought. Yet, and everything as made of thought, of information. Same like all matter is made of energy, but then energy is states, quantum states. It's information. It's like the more fundamental essence. So yeah, understanding the numbers, the through mathematics, which is, and logic, like these languages we are refining and discovering fields within it, and perhaps we can invent better technique to explore that. Yet we are not near the full potential of the technique we have already evolved. Many people have much challenge with very base functions in numbers. But this is part of that sensor. Of course, each sensor can be interpreted more intuitively and more analytically, So still one can have intuitive inspiration and dreams, yet the combination of both hemispheres in the perception of the input brings the full potential, and in a way it's like one represent the perceiving it direct from the source, but then it's highly conditioned through preconceptions, and the other is more through the analytic, the memory that we crystallized as that function of -1, that we can then take it to this e in the power of pi I and make that -1 something way more complex, and then perceive much deeper that same essence, yet it's still zero. It's like the intuition perceives from the next stage of the fractal, and the analysis perceived from within consciousness, like it evolves through integration of parts within. And it's two sides of the same coin, and every sensor can be perceived like that. Like we can analyze the tastes of what we eat, and we can sense it intuitively, or same with every sensor. Yet one sensor I have not talked about is the sensor that perceives the four-dimensionality, like this plasmatic state of matter, these electromagnetic fields, this life force that it's like the representative of life, maybe to say. And like the pacemaker in the heart, in the center of the heart, as the sensor for it, like echoing with a vibration around. Every cell generates a plasmatic field. We are in an ocean of biofield. It's like all full of bacteria here, and there is something beautiful with the quality of these electromagnetic fields, that they can merge into creating a super field, which is now again a field. So like every cell in my body have its own, like it's a singularity in that sense, a four-dimensional singularity, yet all of them together as me is also a four-dimensional singularity. So it's same idea that echoes to higher dimensions. It just refines itself, but yeah, also all the way to 8-dimensionality of consciousness. But there is an important vantage point in 4-dimensionality as well, which is like the center of our experience. And the ability to observe ourselves objectively, observe our experience objectively, our feelings and emotions objectively, non-identified yet fully present, fully conscious, not compromising consciousness, but both ways, not compromising that half that is it, and not compromising the half that observe it objectively. It's like both of them, subjective and the objective, to have maximum perception. So not identified is those objective four dimensions, and the subjective four dimensions is the identified, so to be fully present with it as well. And in a way, it's the representation of the two hemispheres that every sensor is processed through both. But this sensor, like the sensor that senses life force directly, is of course very much influenced also by all the electricity that around, but still life is powerful, and we can learn to be more aware of it. So also with that we can connect to feeling of life force intuitively. We can sense it as love or as just vitality, which vitality would be slightly more including the objective. Love is like fully subjective, or any emotion, but like it have been mentioned in many ancient cultures. Some familiar ones probably is like chi or prana, mana, like just energy that is basically more abundant than the air we breathe. There is so much air. So it's not only everywhere there is air, it's also within us, it's moving through us, it's under the ground, it's all around. There is a lot of life force, which, yeah, we can experience it as love, we can experience it, specific frequencies of it, as whatever emotion, but it's like the whole body is a sensor of it, because the pacemaker is these 4 cells that receive the vibration of it, but it's like the whole body is an echo chamber relative to them, and the brain receives the input from the tissue that is between, like that is around these cells. And it's through the nuances of the rhythm, of the pulsation of the heart, but the heart extends itself through all the arteries and veins and lymph even. So as more we connect to our body, yes, we also refine other senses like touch and hearing, but also, and very dominantly, that sensor. Because in a way it's the central sensor of our biological experience, is that sensor. And to observe ourselves objectively yet fully present, or non-attached yet conscious, supports the brain to evolve these wirings to perceive 4-dimensional motion, at least intuitively more clearly, but then we can also bring the analytic aspect to refine the definition of it. And it's like the next stage from releasing the habit of 3-dimensional visualization Like visualization can go all the way to six dimensionality in its six dimensional crystal, perhaps, but so five dimensional freedom of motion, of imagination, relatively easily, but it's not even about the visualization, is freeing the imagination to experience that more, and therefore like to imagine it more, and therefore to experience that more, and ourself as just a field of life force. And it's like a key key stage to release that stagnation of the imagination and move on. It will move naturally to more, integrating the left hemisphere with it. Like the form helps to put it in formation, like in form, but it's also just the mind itself, the absolute, the Godhead, some would call it, the Buddha mind. And yeah, that's a piece of the original Tao. Um, yeah, it's a beginning. More will come.